welcome. As you can see, I'm very into PowerPoints. I'm Kate, and welcome to my TED Talk. Historical accuracy versus historical adequacy is something I get on a soapbox about fairly frequently. I do like history. I majored in history in college. It's been a little bit, but it is a passion of mine. It's how I got into costuming. And I thought this would be a good topic for me to present because while I do actually like aiming at historical accuracy with certain projects, it's not the end-all be-all. I did spend an inordinate amount of time hand stitching an 1880s corset. Again, hand stitching the corset together. So I very much appreciate attempts at historical accuracy, and that's an attempt at it. But there are limits to historical accuracy, and there's been a lot of gatekeeping going on. As someone pointed out in the comments, it's not just our community, it's all over the place. But this is specifically affecting our community. So I kind of wanted to speak at what is historical accuracy, what is historical adequacy, so that we can kind of take a look at it. I know a fair number of people have felt criticized that their project wasn't historically accurate enough. I know when one of the other admins for our Facebook group posted a whole thing about being welcome to post their projects and not criticizing historical accuracy, that a lot of people commented that they needed to hear that because they were afraid to post. So this is a good thing to go over and understand what it is, what it isn't, what are we aiming at, what should you be aiming at, and that type of thing. Again, historical accuracy certainly has its time and its place, but it's not every time and place. But to understand that time and place, we're going to get started. So all my presentations, if you haven't seen them before, start with a disclaimer page because I get the history stuff, and nothing I ever want to say I don't want to be the end all be all. This is my interpretation of a lot of things. This is an addition to a community that's always growing in research. So just going through my disclaimers, again, my interpretation, others will have varying opinions and definitions. I hope this is a starting place so that people can begin to develop their own opinions and their own idea of what they would like to be creating and doing. So this is a good launching point for that. It's okay to not want to make historically based costumes and instead portray fantasy versions. For those who don't know, I just finished a completely inaccurate medievalish dress that I had a grand old time making for our fantasy challenge. I had a blast. So if you want to do fantasy costumes or some sort of mix between fantasy and historical, that's welcome too. That's not necessarily what we're talking about today, but there's nothing wrong with that, and people should be welcome to do that. And at the Renaissance Fair, we see that all the time. Research is ever evolving. We constantly see new discoveries in this field. It's the reason why we now know that kirtles were the main support garment for most of the Tudor period, and we didn't really see pairs of bodies come until very late, and we didn't see stays. So it's ever evolving. So taking things almost with a grain of salt, knowing that it might change with a new discovery, is important. No one should be stuck in a corner told they can't participate because of race, ethnicity, age, gender, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, disability, economic status, etc. If I missed something you identify with, I apologize. I tried to make a comprehensive list. I've seen people post on other people's pages that they can't wear that outfit because it doesn't match their ethnicity. That's not on our page, but people on Instagram are mean. That's nothing I would like to see here. I love to see people do all sorts of things. There's a disabled costumer who's in a wheelchair who's made some very cool stuff that I've seen pictures floating around. Just because a wheelchair might not be historically accurate doesn't mean that they can't participate. Depending on the era you're aiming to emulate, there are sumptuary laws. It's useful. I like them because they're interesting for me to study. Not the end all be all. My daughter wanted a purple dress. My 3.5-year-old's favorite color is purple. I was not going to say, no, honey, you can't have the purple dress because you're not representing royalty. That said, if I am making a dress, I might avoid the purple if I'm not trying to be somebody in the royal family in, say, Tudor, Elizabethan England. But it's something to keep in mind when you're designing an outfit, how you want to use those sumptuary laws and if you do or don't want to follow them. So being aware of them is helpful. But ultimately, we're all makers in a community. Gatekeeping has no place here. Everybody is at different levels of their learning process. It doesn't matter if you have only a few months of sewing or it's your first project, like you're welcome here. If you've been sewing 40 years, then you're welcome here. And there's always something new to learn, always something new to discover, and something new that we can learn from each other, even if it's you're working on a brand new project. So that's kind of my disclaimer page. My stuff tends to be a little sensitive because I do the history, so I don't ever want someone to come into something I'm talking about and think, well, I have to do it that way because Kate says we have to do it that way based on history. So that's why I find it important to do this type of disclaimer page. Questions. So if anybody has questions, you can try to interrupt me throughout, either speak up or post something in the chat, and maybe somebody else who doesn't mind speaking up can let me know to look there. I am a one-woman show today, so I don't have somebody reading through the chat to kind of wave at me to tell me to stop if there's questions. I will be doing questions at the end, so if it's just easier to save your question, feel free to do that. But feel free to try to interrupt me. Just know that I might take a second to hop back on my train of thought. That said, do we have any questions just on introducing? I see that there's stuff in the chat, but I don't know if it's for me. Oh, okay, not for me. Okay, so let's keep going. Or not, because it doesn't want to go. Okay, so what is historical accuracy and what is historical adequacy? Historical accuracy is using the materials and techniques of a particular period to directly reproduce a garment that would have been worn during that specific period. Historical adequacy, and I did abbreviate them both because writing a historical accuracy and historical adequacy throughout this whole presentation would have driven everybody nuts. It just would have made things kind of annoying to look at. Historical adequacy is using materials available and techniques familiar with the maker to reproduce a period garment's silhouette, structure, and general appearance to replicate a garment that would have been worn in that specific time period. So fabric choice, materials you use, how you construct the garment, how you create the correct silhouette. Are you building it into your actual dress, or are you wearing proper undergarments to kind of create the silhouette? All play into whether the end product is historically accurate or historically adequate. We are going to take a closer look at those types of breakdowns to take a look at what type of fabric is historically accurate versus adequate. But I am going to pause for questions. Any questions specifically on the definitions themselves that I have up here? Okay. So fabric choices. Under historically accurate, we have wool, linen, and silk. I do have cotton. I will address that in a second. Historically adequate, we have wool, wool blends, poly wool, cotton, cotton blends, linen, linen blends, silk, silk blends, satin, cotton, cotton blends, polyester. Some of these things are better for the environment than others, but honestly, some people can't just go buy a bunch of wool. It's just not within the budget. It's not within our accessibility to go out and get it. So there are limitations. There's also weather limitations to what we wear. We might be representing an outfit that might have been worn in the bitter cold, but it's August in New York, or we're in Texas, or we're in California. So what we wear makes a difference. But if we want to be strictly historically accurate, and you're looking at Western Europe, we're looking at wool, linen, and silk. Silk would have been reserved for somebody who can afford it. but wool and linen would have been used across the board. Now I do have cotton on here. And that's because while it wasn't prevalent in Western Europe until the 17th century, an argument can be made for using it in styles that are Greek, Italian, or Spanish. There was a cotton trade going on from the Middle East across, and especially with the Muslim invasion that had happened up into Spain, you would have seen an increase of cotton. So an argument can be made with that. Since those countries are in Europe, I did want to include them. But if you're doing something in France or Germany or England, you really want to stick to wool, linen, and silk. Did throw cotton in there just because there are some evidence that there is a trade going on there, and cotton was known to Western Europe, even if it wasn't strictly used that often. Something else to note is leather would have been used to make like turn shoes and things like that. I haven't seen any evidence that it was used in actual like garments, but I've seen arguments made for it to be used in, say, Viking wear or something like that. So I think those are fair arguments, even if we haven't found strict historical evidence. I probably would place that a little bit more on the historically adequate side because we haven't seen strict historical proof that I know of. But that's why some things get a little woolly with this. Now, fabric choices are probably the most obtainable part of trying to aim at historical accuracy versus adequacy. There are still the limitations in cost, accessibility, and weather. And there's different complications that we don't necessarily think about all the time. The weight of their wool fabric wouldn't have necessarily been the weight of the wool fabric we can buy in our stores. So that's something to balance. And we also might call something by one name and they called something by the same name, but meant something completely different. They might have called something cotton that we wouldn't have considered cotton, or we think of cotton as what we have in America. That's not necessarily what they would have been using from the Middle East, because while they're the same species of plant, they could be a little different. So the weights are different and how they would have used them are different. So if you want to be strictly historically accurate, you have to be very careful to check the weight of the fabric beyond just the what makes up the fabric. So it gets a little tricky, it gets a little hairy. I would say that even in fabric choice, most of the fabric choices that we choose probably go more towards the historically adequate side because we don't have the same materials that they had, even if we try to replicate it exactly. So there's some balance there. Again, this is probably the most accessible part of trying to aim at strict historical accuracy, but it's still a tricky thing to aim at. Are there any questions? Oh, I see someone on the chat. Any questions at this point? Yes, bolt widths would have been different. They would not have been as wide as we can get now, which is why piecing is period. You would not have been able to make a full skirt without piecing things together. So that's a very good point from Tabitha. We don't always think about bolt widths when we put things together because we just buy more yardage, but you couldn't get a full width of a skirt panel always on a bolt width. Are there any other questions on fabric choices? Okay. Obtaining fabric. This is where it gets, okay, are we being pedantic or are we being historically accurate? I would argue they're one and the same because I studied history and so I like being pedantic. Obtaining fabric. So if you want to be historically accurate, you would repurpose a previous garment that was hand spun. You would hand spin your own fabric and use dye from natural plants. You would visit the local clothier and obtain fabric in its natural state and dye using natural methods. You would have someone obtain your fabric and design your dress. You could also visit a tailor or a mantua maker. I am going to cover that a little bit in construction, and they will build you a dress. But since we're talking about us building dresses, this is just how to obtain fabric. Whereas historically adequate, you could visit the thrift store. You can order online, visit the fabric store, attend a de-stash party, go to one of our sister Facebook groups and see if anyone is selling fabric. Shout out to our sister Facebook groups. Or you can repurpose something from your closet that is not necessarily historically accurate to begin with and make it look historically adequate. So there are ways to do this. I am not going to take the time to hand spin my fabric personally. If that's something that you enjoy doing, there are some people who do that they sit and they hand spin their trim or they hand spin their wool. And I think that is spectacular. And that sounds like a lot of fun. I just don't have time for it right now, which is why I buy my trims. But that is a difference between historically accurate versus historically adequate. So that's just something that you need to weigh when you go, okay, is my garment historically accurate versus historically adequate? And what does that mean for me? Okay, construction. I think we all know with construction that up until the 1850s, it was hand sewing for the most part. That's when the sewing machine became mass produced, 1850s. So that's when we start seeing normal people getting sewing machines to start putting that together. And if you want to see an example of a really old sewing machine, Bernadette Banner just did a whole unboxing of one. I think it was from the 1860s, but I could be wrong. If somebody in the comments remembers what year that actually the sewing machine was from, let me know and I will shout that out. But I think it was the 1860s. It was quite old. Also in construction, you want to only use natural fiber thread if you're going for historical accuracy. Oh, is that somebody who remembers? So I know she got a new one. Okay, 1864 it's saying. Yeah, she has 3 old machines, I think, at this point. But she just unboxed a new one on Saturday. So it looks like 1864. Thank you, Janie. I hope I said your name right. Someone else is saying 1876. I'm not sure, but it was old. We'll just go with it was old. Okay. It was from the mid 1800s. We'll just leave it out that way. So that's when people really started getting sewing machines. Only natural fiber thread would have been used. Oh, I see more in the chat. Okay, hers was 1876. Okay. Thank you, everyone who is shouting it out. I couldn't remember. They would have only used natural fiber thread. That would be linen or silk for the most part if we want to stay mainly historically accurate. I think you can find examples of cotton or wool somewhere, but that wouldn't be the norm if we're talking period. So I would say linen or silk for the most part. The thread count would have also been different. That's how many threads are twisted and woven together to create the actual thread chain. I think 3 is historically accurate for most period pieces until we get a little later. But that is a little hard to find nowadays. So even the amount of threads in your thread can make or break your historically accurate construction. Patterning using historical methods. Historically accurate patterning wasn't really a thing like we think about it today. Patterns came about and started becoming produced and available in the mid 1800s. Mid 1800s was a big time for home sewing. But prior to that, you'd probably either change or repair what you already had or try to drape something simple on yourself. You would go to a tailor for male clothes or a mantua maker for dresses. Tailors would have more of a patterning block that they would use that they would then change to meet their clients' actual measurements. Mantua makers would drape the fabric around women So actually drape it and like move it and squeeze it to where it actually is going to fit. So that's how I personally make my kirtles. I don't use a pattern when I make my kirtles. I literally throw the sheet like over my head with a hole in the middle and I pinch it until it fits. It's very hard to do to yourself because you're moving. And so either you're pricking yourself with pins or you are unable to get the fit exactly right. But that is how I choose to make my kirtles. So that is the more historically accurate way of doing that, though I wouldn't say I'm historically accurate in my method. Manuals would have been held between like masters and apprentices. They would not have been readily available, even if tailors did have a sort of pattern that they could use and instructions that they could use for making their garments. But if you gave those out, you lost business. They needed people to come and pay them because they were in a trade society. Now, putting all these garments together, they didn't have to be neat. I know we try to think of finishing all our seams pretty. Well, if we look at extant garments, the inside of those garments weren't always the prettiest. So if you don't care to finish your seams, congratulations, you're historically accurate. And that's the excuse I always use. So you can feel free to use that too. That's not to say that some people didn't finish the inside of the garment, but we see a lot of beautiful gowns and you look on the inside and go, what did they do to you? And when they would take things in to fit somebody else, they wouldn't necessarily be pretty about it. They could add or take away fabric depending on how they want to change the size of it. So it's not these beautiful constructions inside and out that we sometimes think of. So if you want to be historically accurate and not finishing your seams, I am there to support you. You're in good company. I don't like finishing my seams. I want to put my dress on and go have fun. And that's what I'm going to say about the historically accurate side of this. Now, historically adequate, hand sew or use the machine at will. I do both. I use my machine for some things and I hand sew other things. Sometimes I hand sew just to prove a point to myself. But that doesn't make it any more or less adequate whether I'm hand sewing or if I'm using a machine. Use natural or poly thread. All-purpose thread, most of it's poly thread that's readily available. I use poly thread. Natural thread a lot of times does require waxing and more preparation and knowing a little bit more about the properties and how to use that thread. I don't do that. I don't personally have experience in doing that. But so that makes my sewing automatically more historically adequate. Now you can drape, self-pattern, or purchase a pattern as long as the final look is reflective of the correct period. There are a lot of great places to go get patterns out there that are taken from extant garments. So you can get a historical pattern, but it gives you something to follow, especially if you're new at sewing or if you are less on the self-drape or pattern creation side and you're more about the actual construction side. Getting a historically accurate pattern might be what's best for you and might be what you enjoy. Again, that brings you under the historically adequate side. Okay, but what if you want to be historically inspired? I currently live and breathe in historically inspired. I love it. There's a few things I love more than combining something that's fantasy with something that has historical elements or adding historical elements in what I'm wearing. I'm wearing something that I like to say is slightly historically inspired right now. I enjoy mixing it into my normal wardrobe when I'm not wearing sweatpants and a sweatshirt and chasing a toddler and a 15-month-old. I love adding that type of element. I added a corset from the 1880s, the one I spoke about before, into my wardrobe because I was having back pain. And so that helps support my back and structure better. So I actually felt better, but I made it in a way that I can wear it over my clothes and it made it fashionable as well. So I took something that was historical for what purpose it was used historically as a support garment, and I added it into my everyday wardrobe to actually solve a modern day problem of lifting a toddler and a baby up at the same time. And it was very helpful for me personally. So some ideas to take historically inspired garments, you can take a modern sundress out of the 18th century fabric. There are some gorgeous 18th century fabrics out there, replications of them, and you can make a modern sundress. No one's going to blink an eye at that if you're a little nervous about adding history in, but you want to. A Regency dress out of toilet paper. Now that there's not a mass toilet paper shortage, you can make yourself a dress and then use that and hang it in your bathroom. So you have an art piece and something you can use that's useful. A scarf that looks like a 16th century ruff, because why not? I'm not a huge fan of ruffs, but it could keep your neck very warm. History bounding, just adding historical elements in the day-to-day, taking a historically silhouette, but making it wearable for a particular event or need. If I needed to go to a wedding and it was safe for me to do so, I would consider wearing my historical undergarments underneath a dress to give myself a silhouette that I really like. That's something I would consider doing personally. Using a color banned by sumptuary law in something that actually is historical. So taking something from the Tudor period, wearing that, but putting in colors they wouldn't have necessarily worn in that. Adding historical elements to the outfit, like my corset over top of my normal clothes with jeans. So there are ways to add in your historical elements into your everyday, or going to the fair. If I'm going to just the Celtic Fest in Mount Hope, which is separate from the Renaissance Fair, they have a Celtic weekend, but they have a Celtic Fest. I'm not going to wear full Renaissance Fair garb, but I wore something that was inspired by historical elements because that's something I love doing. So if that's something you love doing too, that would be on the historical inspired side rather than historically adequate or historically accurate. So I put a little bit of a comparison here, and yes, I did put a picture of myself because I don't feel bad about calling it inspired instead of in any way adequate. So if you look on the left, we have an actual historical dress. And then we have Sosteen, who is a wonderful YouTuber. And she also has a great Instagram full of pictures. But she made this beautiful dress. And even if you read her blog about it, she comments that she could have done certain things more historically accurately, but part of what she loves doing is taking modern conveniences or modern machinery and adding it into her historical wardrobe and using that to create it. So she's all about adding in on her embroidery machine instead of hand embroidering, using her actual sewing machine to make things as crisp as possible. So I didn't feel wrong taking this, knowing what she wrote in her blog post about this back in, I think it was 2018 or something. It was a long time ago at this point. That feels like forever ago. But her outfit, as beautiful as it is historically adequate. That's not historically accurate. And then this is one of the things that I wore this summer. This is historically inspired. I was inspired by the 1700s, and I created a summer dress that's laced up the front, and I had a lot of fun doing that too, but that's in no way historically accurate or adequate. So this is kind of like 3 levels of how historically involved you would like to be in your creation process. To be historically accurate or not, that is the question. Now, there are positives and negatives. I think we've all kind of realized through the way I've talked about this that historical accuracy is a far reach. I'm not going to say it's impossible. I'm sure through a lot of work and research, it is possible to recreate a historical garment very accurately. But that is in its own section of what we as sewers or historical costumers or just lovers of history do. So here's some positives to historical accuracy. It's a great research tool. How was this garment made? Would this style have been constructed like this or like this? How did they actually make that stand up like this when they didn't have interfacing? What undergarments would you have needed to create that silhouette? It's a challenge. I did my corset hand sewn simply to say that I did my corset hand sewn. It was a challenge to myself as somebody who was just learning to hand sew, to say, okay, this is my goal and I'm going to meet it. So it's a great way to challenge yourself to go, okay, I'm going to do as much as possible to meet this dream. And then it's fulfilling your own interests. If you have an interest in history and that's why you're involved in this community, then it might be right up your alley to aim at historical accuracy. But it really is kind of like reaching for the stars. It's almost an impossible dream for us nowadays to reach for historical accuracy, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try if that's what you want to do. So it has a lot of positives to it. That said, it has some downsides. It's hard to get the materials, price and access. Somebody I know has to drive 2 hours to get to a fabric store, and it really is hard to order fabric online. I do it, but you can't feel it. You have to imagine how that fabric is going to drape for your project, and that's not always the easiest thing to do. It's just easier to be able to touch and feel and move the fabric and feel the bolt and know what you're getting. It's also pressure because it's not just doing what works, it's doing what works for another time. Again, no interfacing. You got to starch the heck out of that thing or build yourself a metal cage to hold it. You can't just get what works that you've done before. There is missing knowledge. We don't know how they did certain things. We're looking at portraiture and some of the surviving garments, and the further back you go, the less extant garments there are. So there's always going to be evolving research. There's always going to be something new. So those are the negatives to aiming at historical accuracy. And again, there are some real positives because it advances research. It's interesting to us. I love historical accuracy and aiming at it. My corset, I can't talk about it enough. I love that thing. It's historically adequate, but I was aiming at historically accurate. So if we're looking at the difference, historical accuracy is really more on the research and historical study side, while historically adequate is the realistic version of what we are aiming at as sewists and costumers. So that's the balance of the two, and it really depends on what you in particular are aiming at for either project, how much towards one or how much towards the other you're actually going to end up or you're actually going to strive towards. Okay, do I need to be historically accurate or historically adequate to go to the fair? No. Most fairs have costuming rules for performers, but not patrons. There are certain events like reenactments that might have dress requirements. It's always a good idea just to double check where you're going to make sure there aren't dress requirements, but generally no. If you're going to a regular Renaissance fair as a patron, there's no reason. So this is a picture from the Pennsylvania Renaissance Fair. You'll see in the picture, we have a nice young gentleman slouching in the front with high socks. We have what kind of looks like a medieval princess somewhere in the audience. I think we can see a pirate somewhere in there. So there's a real mix on who comes to the fair, and a lot of people come in normal, everyday, lay person, modern clothes. And if you do go in costume, the more you look like you fit into the fair, at least at Pennsylvania Renaissance Fair, expect people to ask you where to find things because they just think you're part of the event, which for me is part of the fun, is that I feel like I belong there. But you don't need to be historically accurate. I dressed as Princess Leia for Halloween because that's what my 3-year-old decided we were all doing this year, Star Wars. So I went to the fair with my cinnamon roll bun hair, and I had a grand old time. Is that historically accurate? No, it's from someplace far, far away. But it was good fun. You don't need to be historically accurate at the fair unless you really want to aim at that. And even then, you're going to be historically adequate for the most part. So this is informational because I don't find a lot of halfway decent timelines that lay it out this easily. So this is just informational. I thought this might be good to see the general timelines of periods in Western Europe. So from medieval and then moving through the different periods. I hope that's helpful to somebody. If it's not, well, it was there. So here we go. So this was presented in connection with Sewing for Renaissance Festivals Facebook group. We do have a YouTube channel, search for Sewing for Renaissance Festivals, and we do have 2 sister Facebook groups that sell fabrics and supplies and garbs and accessories. So you could either be the seller or the buyer on either of those 2 groups. So that's open if you would like to join. If you'd like to teach a class, please reach out to me on Facebook, Kate Marie Turnipseed. You'll find me commenting all over everything on the Renaissance Festivals Facebook group. And if you want to look at some of the things I've made, that's where I am on Instagram. Before I open for questions, I'm supposed to do the normal YouTuber thing, I think. So if you're new to us and you haven't subscribed, there's a subscribe button somewhere. And if you want notifications, ring the bell, and other things will be appearing somewhere or other, but I don't know where because I don't know what I'm doing with this. So I'm going to go ahead and switch out of presentation mode, and I'm going to open for questions. We are still going to be recording, so if you don't want to be on camera, you can just unmute yourself, but keep the video hidden. So just FYI that we're still recording. So let me just stop this share. Okay. Do I have any questions or anybody want to hop in on anything? Questions going once. Questions going twice.
How do you get someone who is so set on being picky towards others, but then turning around and not wearing what they're picking on someone else for? Historically accurate or adequate wise?
Other than getting them a therapist, that was, yeah. That's hard because that sounds like they're slightly insecure about what they're wearing themselves. If they're picking on others and then not following through with it, that sounds like a typical bullying scenario. I mean, I don't find it helpful in any way to say, well, you're doing all these things wrong, because that's really not going to change their mind, unfortunately. So if they're really stuck on their ways, maybe try to slip into conversation, like some other people's outfits and how cool these certain things are, how you like these elements, and try to bring that up subtly in conversation and kind of see if they'll move even slightly. But that's a hard one because that feels like a typical bullying self-esteem problem if they're picking on others and then not following through on what they are wearing. So that's, I don't typically do a good job of keeping my mouth shut. I probably would come up with a sarcastic comments.
Yes, I understand that one. but in our case, Casey and I have had to go back to being members of our costume committee for the fact that the 2 of us look at people's monetary, what they can spend, how much they know, what they can get a hold to in a certain amount of time. Whereas the people I'm talking about, they're like, oh, well, you can't wear that. And I'm like, yeah, actually they can.
Can you put it down in writing with this is our exact guidelines, and anything beyond this when it comes to historical adequacy was a great goal, but here's the minimum of what is required for this, and then maybe make it part of the requirements for coming on cast to have a kind of like a short class, an orientation, like almost like this, that you sit down and go, okay, well, here's what we allow, and this is the minimum of what's allowed, and anything you do beyond that is your own choice, but here's what we're looking at.
I teach the peasant and lower middle class costuming committee classes. And so they get a comprehensive amount of information from me. And so, but then you have the other folks who teach the upper middle class and the nobility class, and they are the ones that we had issue with trying to talk down about our peasants and lower middle class. And there were times I had to go to our entertainment director and go, look, tell them to give it up.
I'm a 3 strikes you're out type of person. If I have to give you 3 warnings to actually be a kind person, then I'm going to stop being a kind person and tell you to leave. But I am very I have my moments.
I have a lot of those moments, and so I have people who look at me and go, not now, not now.
Yeah, I'd be the one there telling that now. Again, I love I love aiming at historical accuracy. So like I'm all about like, no, this is not right if that's what you're trying to do. But if it's not what you're trying to do, then
our festival is more in the line of historical adequacy.
Yes.
Just as long as we have the look, they're happy.
Yeah, so maybe reminding them of that, and then if they get pushy again, say, look, not everybody can wear the upper class garments, and as long as they meet the aesthetic of the festival, that is what we're counting on, and thank you for your opinion, we've heard you, but we're not listening. But then I would get myself in trouble. But that's exactly what I would probably say to them, because it's
actually, I did tell my entertainment director that they were no longer allowed to say anything at all about the lower middle class or peasants, because I had that handled and it was none of their business.
Yes. So Tabitha recommends maybe ask them if they'd like to sew for everybody up to their standards. If you can say, I love that. I don't think I can say that without sarcasm. But again, I get snippy when somebody gets too pushy about certain things. And again, this is a soapbox topic for me. But I think that's a spectacular response. Okay, Tabitha is also a sarcastic person.
Oh, so yes, I am.
I
am severely sarcastic, so I tried to
response. I think that's spectacular. So thank you for
I will try that and go, hey, you want to sew for everybody? Then go ahead.
And if they ask you for a budget, say, I thought you were doing this on your own dime.
Yep.
Just give them a straight out, I saw another, so I think Tabitha, that is a gold comment.
Yep.
So Amanda asks, because I don't know in this recording if everybody will be able to see the chat, so I'm going to read it out loud. Do you have any recommendations for what keywords to look for with regard to wool to get really historically looking drape? Most wool I find locally here is really heavy and makes great modern peacoats, but is too heavy for full dress. No, because I can't find wool that I like to use to make historically accurate costumes. I actually use a lot more cotton than I do wool because I can't find one weighted the way I like. I wish I could give you some keywords to say. maybe there is lightweight wool out there. It's out of my price range, but there is lightweight wool out there. Maybe that type of weighted wool. You might be able to if you're in a farm community. I know we have an alpaca farm nearby that actually like creates fabric out of the wool. Again, I don't have any, but that's supposed to be spectacular. So maybe local farmers or that type of market would have something more, depending on your area. Janie says tropical weight wool. Suzanne says summer weight wool. Bobby says suiting merino would be my suggestions. Wool suiting, men's suiting. So if you look up lightweight wool, you'll get a lot of men's suiting fabric. So I think Mood Fabric, if you go there, they have a wide selection of things that might be a good place to start. I don't know necessarily that they would be where I would ultimately order from, but it is a place to start. Bernie and Trowbridge, a lot of people get historically accurate wool from there. Probably more British oriented fabric sellers would probably have better weighted wool for what you're looking for, just because it's easier to get wool over there in a lot of ways from what I understand. I hear somebody. Does somebody want to jump in? No? Okay. Do I have any other questions? I hear somebody.
Oh, I was going to just jump in and sorry. It's going back to the other lady's comments about people being snarky about their costuming for middle and lower classes. I mean, I was a courtier for both Ren fairs I was in, CRF and Georgia. And really, our stuff was pretty much historically adequate. It certainly can't qualify to meet, historically accurate unless you were in the living history group. I mean, I think that's kind of the bottom line. We're all doing our best. And even the reality is we're still all using modern techniques and finding the best fabrics we can. But I don't know that anyone actually had 100% silk brocades and, some of the other things that would have been, leaning toward the accuracy level. So that's all. Sorry.
Yeah, no, you're good. Thank you for jumping in.
And we have an excellent fabric store down here in Atlanta called Gail K, and they have like an incredible wool selection.
Okay.
So I did an entirely hand sewn 14th century ladies ensemble, and I had my linen undergarment, and then I bought 2 weights of wool for the underdress and the overdress, and people would feel that lightweight go, oh my gosh, where did you get this summer weight wool? Because I wore it in summer. So yes, it is possible, but I think they're right about looking for summer or tropical.
Yes. So I think Nick of Time Textiles up in Allentown might have some options there as well, because they have a lot of options. If you've never been there, it's like the coolest place to walk into. But I did not, I had fun at their clearance. Okay, so Nick of Time selection is limited in the wool department. So thank you, Bobby. I went right to their clearance department and just had fun for my birthday. So I'm not sure, but there are options out there. What type of fabric did I use for my summer dress? So I had linen underneath, and then I had a really, really, really light cotton on top. That was almost like a gauze. So that's what I did. Nick of Time, yes. And if you go to our YouTube channel, I actually filmed a slight tour of it, so you can kind of see what the inside looks like. My husband brought me there for my birthday. So he organized babysitting with my parents, and yeah, so if you go to our YouTube page, not our Facebook page, our YouTube page, I kind of filmed going up, but you take this old industrial elevator up to Nick of Time, and then I ended up with 18 yards of fabric for $20 out of their clearance section. So That's why I didn't look anywhere else. I had a good old time in the clearance section. Yeah. So if you're near Allentown, I highly suggest going and having some fun. So there's that. Are there any other questions? I do have the chat up, so I can see. That's why I'm responding to people. Okay. So if there are any other questions that come up later, you're always welcome to message me on Facebook or Instagram. I try to be responsive. Depends on if anybody is screaming because their train got taken away, but I try to be responsive as possible. If you haven't checked out how strict do you think is appropriate for costume/garb eras? Can you clarify a little bit, Tabitha? I don't understand your question. Strict do you think is
Sorry. I was just trying to keep it simple, but
Yeah.
like compared to early Tudor to late Tudor, you go from almost the long draping medieval gowns into something more similar to the Elizabethan gowns.
Yes.
So like when we think appropriate for events, within what range of dates would you count for like an era?
Okay. So if you're going to a Tudor event, you probably want to go Henry VIII. Elizabethan events, you want to be Elizabethan somewhere in that time frame. I did another class where I actually had slides up talking about, okay, this Renaissance fair said that they're this year and here's what they were wearing, which is more this year. So there is a lot of mixing across the decades in the actual fair itself. And if you're talking about being on cast with a fair, that they might have separate restrictions. So I can't speak to that because there are hundreds of them. So you'd have to look at the actual restrictions of the fair you're looking at being part of if you're looking at being on cast. But if you're going to a Tudor event, you want to look at Henry VIII's era. So maybe like Anne Boleyn type dresses. Again, Elizabethan, you can have a ball with however high you want to make things. But that would be, from what I see, more appropriate for the Tudor type events. If you're going to a medieval event, most of the medieval period, you get a general similar type of garment. If you're going as a peasant, the garment stays relatively the same throughout all of that time period. And then if you're going later, if you're not going to, say, a Renaissance fair, but you're going to a Dickens festival or something like that, they're usually more specific in exactly what year they're taking part in, at least from what I've seen, because the silhouettes can vary so much. So I don't know if that helped, but I hoped it helped a little bit. Okay, any other last minute questions? Okay, CRF doesn't pick a year, but in the living history troop we did. So we had a jumping point and try to stay smaller range. So yeah, different fairs, if you're actually going to be working at the fair, might have specific guidance on what you should or shouldn't be wearing. I know somebody on the Facebook group was talking about how they weren't allowed to wear, I think it was anything that laced up, but I'm not sure if I'm remembering that correctly. So I don't know why or how that would work, but that's something to look at if you're going to be on cast. I would assume, I'm not on cast. I would assume that you would be able to get a general idea, either looking at past fairs, what they wore, or seeing what they put out online if you're going to audition ahead of time. But if you're just being a patron, it's really more up to your discretion for the most part. Okay, any other last minute things? I think it's also important to remember costume and garb doesn't have hard stops as fashion evolved. The changes were gradual. Yes, they were. And it wasn't like a blink of an eye and now it's completely different. And people repurposed old outfits to try to meet new silhouettes. So there is more of a range than what we see in just like strict portraiture of this is what they're wearing at this particular time. So thank you, Christy, for adding that important point in. Oh, I hear somebody typing something. Okay. Well, again, if you have, yes, materials were expensive, labor was cheap. Yes. I feel like both are expensive now. But yes, if anything pops up, or if you think of any questions, I try to be relatively friendly despite being snarky to people who can't get their act together, as displayed by some of my responses to Marie. And her issue with people not being particularly polite to others in her group. Marie, I would really be curious to hear how that resolves. So please let me know. I hope that resolves much better than how they've been.
I most certainly will.
Thank you. I can never get my act together. Well, all we can do is try, right? So with that, I'm going to sign off. Again, if you haven't joined our YouTube channel, there's going to be a subscribe button somewhere and some other videos somewhere or other. And when I upload this at some point, I'll figure out where to point, but right now I don't. So take care, everyone. I hope you have a nice evening. Bye.